to provide some knowledge, I suppose, to improve control is the aim of the game, and particularly trying to get people to be more proactive with their control. Trying to control snails and slugs once you already see damage is shutting the gate after the horse has bolted. And part of that, and it's quite exciting to be involved with a new product that is actually attractive, because attractiveness is important. So hopefully today, first part will be touching on this importance of having an attractive bait, a true bait, and then we'll then go into some trial data of showing some results that we can actually get when we get things right. Excellent. What's going on? It's not fancy through. There you go. So we all know 2020 was a great year for snails and slugs. And so the numbers have built up greatly. I haven't got data from 2011-12 season, but this season slug numbers have continued to be active over the summer. But there was, long-term monitoring sites, there was 9 or 10 slugs per refuge in November, December, when normally at that time of year, I don't get any. And as we know, monitoring in the springtime gives us a good indication of the populations and the numbers we're going to have to deal with, both in the autumn when we're baiting for snails, and then at sowing when we're protecting the crop from slugs. I think everybody's got plenty of cover crops this year growing over the summer, and a lot of damp conditions has seen also the survivability of slugs. And it's good we did a weather forecast, because again, the weather in sort of April, May, when the slugs normally become active again, will determine actually when they become active. But we know that we'll probably have very high pest pressures this season. So it's important to be on top of the job. And the really exciting thing, though, is with a replacement for Matterx, this Matterx it's got new technology out of Europe. And we happened to see trials of this in 2013. It's finally made it to the Australian shores. And it really is an enhanced delivery system. So it's still relying on the old metaldehyde as your active ingredient to actually kill slugs and snails, but with the improved attractiveness, the enhanced palatability, sees a faster, more efficient kill, particularly on juveniles, which can be difficult to control going into that late May period. And it's a persistent control, so we know it will continue to kill things for a month. And so basically, it gives growers, you guys, a chance to really increase the efficacy in the job you're doing, and do it with confidence, so you don't have to go back and reapply. So it builds on the traditional Matterx. As we know, it's known as one of the best products on the Australian market. It's consistent, it spreads evenly. Once you calibrate your spreader, you know that each batch will be the same. And it's backed as a package by the French company Desangos, delivered in Australia by Agnova. So we're not just providing a product, it's a package to improve control of slugs and snails, and hence why I've been engaged by Agnova to help today improve your knowledge. As Dave said, it was registered last year. It's highly compatible with integrated pest management. And I believe it has the greatest efficacy after rainfall from the work I've done of any of the current products on the Australian market. And that's not just sitting it in a jar and seeing that it's still a pellet 12 months later. That's actually putting it in a lab assay and seeing if it kills stuff. And as I mentioned earlier, it is very consistent in size. The coefficient of variation between batch and within batch is often around about that coefficient of variation of 10%, where you look at most other competitors on the Australian market, their coefficient of variation within batch would be 25% and between batches up to 35%. So what that means is when you're spreading it, if you've got an inconsistent size pellet, you don't actually quite know how far you're spreading it. So you can confidently set your machinery up with a consistent pellet, whereas with inconsistent pellets, you might end up with zebra stripes, as quite often when you're trying to go too wide or in windy conditions with the small pellets, you don't always get an even spread. The other important thing is the improved homogenised bait, where they've taken a lot of effort to basically bake a cake rather than, say, the old brand-based products or some of the current products on the market that have a high active loading as well of 50 grams of metaldehyde. You can see with the improved delivery, the more palatable product, they're actually, snails and slugs are more likely to consume a lethal dose, which is particularly important in cold conditions when their metabolism is slower. They require more active to actually die. And particularly the INOV with the 40 grams of active ingredient per kilo or 4%, you're delivering over twice as much as comparable cheaper products on the market. So you're actually getting better bang for your buck because you're making sure you're actually delivering a lethal dose to your targets. And that is one of the problems with smaller pellets where they're not as palatable, is actually all you're doing is increasing the probability of delivering a sublethal dose. Because it's one thing to have them encounter it, but the second thing to ensure good performance of slug and snail baits is making sure that they actually consume a lethal dose. It's not like spraying where you know what you're delivering. With this, you're relying on the individual feeding to actually make sure that it consumes enough. So I think this palatability and the improved palatability of these newer products, particularly Matterx INOV, is really good at ensuring that we get a lethal dose. And I think that's why we're seeing some better results anecdotally from industry. So down in Tasmania in the poppies last year, the poppy growers were really chasing smaller juvenile slugs in the springtime, affecting their poppy crops under quite high pressures. And they found that the new Matterx INOV was highly efficacious against juvenile slugs. And we think we're seeing similar things with snails. We hopefully get more money from Agnova to do more research on particularly juvenile snails. The other important thing is to learn how to drive these PowerPoint presentations is, of course, is the attractiveness. So similarly with slugs, we can see that slugs in particular are highly attracted to the Matterx INOV pellet compared to, say, a winter wheat seedling or an oilseed rape or canola seedling or a corn seedling. Now, considering that the Matterx INOV was actually developed from a couple of molecules out of oilseed rape, there is still a preference for the grey field slugs to go to the pellet over a seedling. So I think that's really important when you start to work out how we're going to get an effective result and use lower rates. Because traditionally we've always worked on, from this equation out of Britain, around about 25 to 30 pellets per metre squared for slugs is an optimum number for pellet density. When we looked at snails, and again this pellet density work from SARDI data back in 2015, again this was mortality, and we assume, you know, if they actually feed on a pellet they will die. Again you see this curve or this exponential response. So you get to a certain point, if you put more pellets out, it doesn't mean you'll continue and improve the probability of encounter. And if you go back and you actually plot the old data from that equation on grey field slugs back in 1970 on cheap brand pellets. Again, you see this similar response curve, where it's basically the attractiveness, the movement of the individual, and the number of pellets you have in a given area, or in other words, the pellet density, is really important in determining probability of encounter. And as you can see here, basically snails, again, see this same response. More recent work in Britain that was presented at the IOBC conference in 2019, again, basically reiterated this, that there was no point increasing your pellet density over that optimum number for slugs of round about 30 to 35. So if you're putting 100 pellet points out by using a smaller pellet, all you're doing is actually increasing the chance of delivering a sublethal dose. Now, if we take Dosangos and the development of Matterx Inov on face value, and you see an increase of attractiveness up to 6 centimetres, we can actually see with these red dots that you can actually achieve at a lower pellet density a higher probability of encounter, as seen by that circle over there. If we're using the lower label rate of Matterx Inov of 4 kilos, we're actually achieving 100% probability of encounter, whereas only 80% roughly if we had the same rate of something that had the old attractiveness too. So that's just increasing attractiveness. And as you could see by that video, I mean, the snail, obviously, it was a reasonable distance in which it was being attracted from. So I think with these new technologies coming out of Europe that are more attractive, I think the whole bait points argument is irrelevant. You need something that is attractive to increase the probability of encounter. You need to be applying baits when the individuals are actually actively feeding. So a lot of times with snails, we may see snails, but they're not actually looking for food. When they are actually in that reproductive phase, as work as Sadi has shown, they are actually looking for food. They, I believe, are attracted to true baits. Is there any questions at this stage?
No, there's none in the chat box. So if anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat box and we'll ask Michael as we have them. But currently, it keeps moving.
So the other thing is of course, with any new product, efficacy trials have to be done. Agnova has a long tradition of conducting a large number of replicated trials in local conditions, as well as relying on substantial overseas data to back up these claims. And in particular, focused on looking at using lower rates, both the lower rate, 4% of metaldehyde compared to 5% metaldehyde in the old Matterx, but also using a lower rate of kilos per hectare. That, of course, has many environmental benefits as well. But basically, a lot of these trials have shown, that the label rates of Matterx Inov are equivalent to the old label rates on the Matterx. Of course, last year, some of the work in southwest Victoria was interrupted by COVID. I've moved back to South Australia, so getting across the Berlin Wall has been difficult. But we're continuing to run an extensive demonstration program. So this is just one. We know in southwest Victoria, in most parts of Australia, small conical snails or small pointed snails are extremely difficult to control. One of the things I've been arguing is actually the baiting for small pointed snails needs to start now, and then you have to go back and rebait when you're protecting your crops from slugs. So there's actually needs to be a double knock approach, targeting the different species because they're active and more susceptible at different times. So this trial was where ryegrass was sown in a dairy pasture, oversown, and the treatments went out actually on the 4th of April. And it's honestly the first time I've ever got a really good response in controlling small conical snails. As you can see, we've got a lot more dead conical snails that we actually found searching, but we also got more ryegrass seedlings by applying at seeding an appropriate rate. And so I think we actually got a fantastic job. Everyone knows how hard conical snails can be to kill. But again, I really do think that that late autumn period, once you have a few dews, is the right time to be putting baits out. And a year like this, it's actually interesting. I had some snails sent in to me the other day. These were round snails, and they were actually already laying eggs. And we all know we should be applying bait before snails lay eggs. So I think, you know, we should really be thinking about looking at the activity of our snails, going out and chucking out a little bit of bait now and seeing if they're taking bait. I think if you wait until late April, once your canola's sown, you'll have missed the boat. And that was quite often the problem last year, where we saw explosions of snail numbers, was the baits just went on too late. So again, it comes back to that understanding that you have an attractive bait and putting it on when the snails are actually actively wanting to feed and are going to be attracted to that bait. And that can be late February. So the other important thing is some trials we did with slugs in a particularly different situation, a similar sort of season where we had large numbers built up in 2016 in the springtime. We thought were high pressures. This was a Sodic type grey, usual Western Victorian, beautiful grey clay loam over clay. This grower had disced in all this stubble and it was quite wet. So it was a brilliant trial site for slugs. They did everything wrong. There was no gypsum go on or anything. And as a result, the yields were quite low in this trial area. But we actually looked at the yield of a standard grower practice of say, a Meta or now I think they're Sabichem or Snailx if you're in South Australia, those cheap ground-based products. We looked at the Matterx at 5 kilos per hectare and the Matterx Inov at 4 kilos a hectare. And we just did some hand cuts to estimate yield. And we can see here that for every dollar spent over and above what we spent on 10 kilos of Meta, we got a $4.38 return for the Matterx and an $8.90 return for every dollar we spent, basically because of the extra yield, the better seedling protection where we applied the Matterx Inov. And we definitely got a much more even crop where both the Matterx and the Matterx Inov was compared to where the Meta was. We take that forward to the pricing. Everyone's always interested in price and how much it works out per hectare. But the Matterx Inov, these are some values that I've been given. You need to check with Brad Johnson, the local Agnova sales rep, to make sure that those prices are right. But if we take those prices and say compare them to say getting a cheap bait at $1 per kilo, you know, I think I know which one I would prefer here. I mean, that's just a photo of grower practice, which is the cheap bait, compared to Matterx Inov at 4 kilos. We just plucked some gross margins off a couple of mates in Southwest Victoria, what they did last year, and the bait costs. So for every dollar we spend on Matterx Inov above what we currently spend on putting out a cheap bait, because it's the lowest cost per hectare, we're getting a $20 return. So I think there the results speak for themselves. You know, which would you prefer? Half a crop or maximising your yield potential, particularly when your land values now are getting up to, what, $5,500 per hectare? I think you want to be maximising your return on investment. So clearly the Matterx Inov has a fantastic return on investment if you look at that 20 to 1. So with that, I think it's extremely excited to be involved with this project. I think we can really get some good results. Baiting once at sowing with a good quality product that you know is going out at the right rate, and you know is being spread evenly, and you know will kill the slugs there and therefore protect your canola seedlings in a year where we're going to have particularly high slug pressures, I believe, given on the data I've been collecting over the last 3 or 4 months. I think, why would you risk trying to cut a few corners to save $20 a hectare when you're looking at the amount of money involved now in growing a canola crop and what you can make off canola? Why do you want to be stuffing around like people were last year, trying to find somebody to spread bait via a plane or bogging around on a paddock because it got wet really quickly in May when you should have had good quality slug control out there? Oh no, we can save a few bucks. We'll just chuck a bit of cheap bait out early and not doing the job properly. And I think really it is this year in particular be imperative. All those growers last year that were proactive and did the job right didn't have the problems. And I think that results from last year just speak for themselves. Use a top quality, latest technology product that delivers a proven active metaldehyde at sowing, so you ensure that you maximise your returns again in 2021.